Today, Janice found herself in an unusually buoyant mood. The reason being, she was just days away from her long-anticipated break. It was her final week at work, and the prospect of an upcoming vacation fueled her excitement. After efficiently completing her work duties, she made her way home, completely unaware of the surprise that awaited her. That evening, she arrived home, her spirits higher than usual. Spotting her husband's packed suitcase in the hallway brought a delighted smile to her face. She assumed he had taken the initiative to pack for their vacation. Sean, her husband, was never particularly good at packing, yet this time he had not only managed to do it himself, but also found the travel pillow something she found both amusing and endearing. "Sean, my love, I'm back," Janice cheerfully announced as she entered the kitchen, but her happiness abruptly faded upon seeing the sight before her. Sean was seated at the kitchen table, a glass of wine in hand. He was dressed not in his usual casual home attire, but as if he was ready to leave the house. "Sweetheart, what's happening? Are you heading out?" she asked, her confusion apparent. "Janice, I'm weary," Sean began, his tone somber. "I need to go now. I need some time to unwind, to rest. I'm afraid I might be depressed." Janice stared at her husband, bewilderment clouding her eyes. "Darling, what do you mean? Can't you wait just one more week?" Janice was at a loss, unable to comprehend the sudden shift in her husband's mood. "You wouldn't understand, Janice," he replied tersely. "You're always cheerful at work, surrounded by your supportive team. Meanwhile, I'm here feeling low and in desperate need of a break." Her eyes then fell on a bank statement lying on the table. To her dismay, it was clear that Sean had transferred the money they had painstakingly saved together into his personal account. Holding the statement, she said, "Sean, what depression are you referring to? We've been saving this money for our shared vacation, for our trip to the Bahamas." "I've been eagerly waiting for this day, and now you're asking me to delay it because your work won't permit you a vacation?" Sean retorted, his voice beginning to show irritation. Janice could feel her anger brewing. "I never said my work wouldn't grant me a vacation," she fired back. "In fact, I agreed with them today that this is my last week. Besides, we never set a specific date for our trip. Why would you plan your leave now, when I can't join?" "You're not being rational today, Janice," he rebuked her. "I told you I'm exhausted. I've had enough of the dreary cold weather. I need a change, somewhere warm, somewhere peaceful." "And what about me?" she demanded, feeling neglected. Her husband merely shrugged in response. "Well, practically speaking, you can't come along. You're tied up with work. I don't understand why we're arguing about this. I'm the head of the family, and I get to decide what's best for us." Sean's brows furrowed, his anger visible. She watched him pack the rest of his belongings. This wasn't some ill-conceived jest. He was serious about leaving alone, without her. "But Sean, that's not fair," she protested. "We saved that money together. If you can't wait for me, at least you should only take your share. Once I get my leave, I'll join you or go somewhere else, using my portion." Sean paused and looked at her, his face devoid of empathy. "What do you want, Janice? Do you want me to stay and have a mental breakdown? How am I supposed to divide the money? What if I run out? How about this? If there's anything left, I'll bring it back. And Janice, I have a huge favor to ask. Don't ruin my mood before the trip. I've mentally already embarked on this journey. In fact, I've booked my flight for tonight." Janice was rendered speechless by his audacity, by the fact that he had already booked his ticket for that very evening. Words seemed to elude her. Pang of hurt constricted her throat, and she retreated to her room to avoid witnessing her husband's departure. She had sensed something amiss lately. He'd been acting out of character, coming home late, initiating uncharacteristic, lengthy conversations. She just couldn't put her finger on why his behavior had suddenly altered. Janice had initially tucked away such troubling thoughts. The fear of confronting them was too daunting. She didn't want to dwell on suspicions that might turn out to be baseless. Instead, she decided to calmly assess the situation. Could it be that she was overreacting? Maybe it wasn't so unusual for a married couple to take separate vacations occasionally. But then, the resounding slam of the front door caused Janice to startle. Did he just leave without even saying goodbye? That can't be happening, she pondered. She stepped out of the room, only to be greeted by the harsh reality that it indeed could happen. Just as she was on the brink of tears, something on the table caught her eye. Sean had left his phone behind. He had a password she didn't know, but an incoming message briefly lit up the screen, providing her enough time to read it. "I'm already at the airport, waiting for you, babe. Give me a call when you get there." Before she could process the message, the front door creaked open and Sean re-entered. He eyed Janice suspiciously, grabbed his phone, then planted a quick kiss on her cheek. "I've got a dash, love. Don't worry about a thing." Janice was momentarily frozen, then swiftly dressed and bolted out the door, frantically waving for a taxi. Their ride to the airport was the longest, most excruciating journey she'd ever taken. She didn't know where to look for him, but unfortunately, they were immediately noticeable, their behavior reminiscent of smitten high school sweethearts. The woman was considerably younger than her. A gasp escaped Janice as she covered her mouth with her hand, watching them from a distance. So, this was it. 5 years of married life. 5 years of believing we were a happy family, she mused. Janice and Sean's story had begun in college. Sean was late for an English class. He was the last one to enter, and there was only one vacant seat. By a stroke of fate, that seat was right next to a very beautiful girl, Janice. Janice was a radiant beauty, so stunning that many guys felt too intimidated to approach her. This lack of attention, paradoxically, dented Janice's self-confidence. She started to believe something was amiss with her, so when Sean ended up sitting next to her, she was immediately intrigued by his apparent courage. For Sean, however, he saw no other choice. He felt at ease sitting next to such an attractive girl, not because he was overly confident, but rather because he deemed himself invisible to her. He believed that he didn't stand a chance, so there was nothing to lose or be nervous about. When a class discussion paired them up, Sean found a reason to talk to her. That's when he discovered that Janice was not just beautiful, but also humble and friendly. Maybe that was when he realized he could sway Janice to his favor. As time went on, Sean grew more comfortable chatting with her, even forgetting their perceived social gap. One day, he offered her a ride home after class. By the end of the semester, they were officially dating. After graduation, they took the next step and got married. But now, their marital bliss had crumbled. Sean was using their shared savings to whisk his mistress away to the Bahamas, while Janice would have to return to work the next day. She would come home to an empty house, waiting for her husband's return from his escapade. She felt utterly alone, without anyone to confide in, seek advice from, or even just vent to. Janice had grown up fatherless, a void that had always gnawed at her. She never experienced a father's guidance, love, or protection, a hollow feeling that left her feeling incomplete. People told her that as she grew older, she would overcome the absence and move on, but the opposite happened. The void magnified over time. In retrospect, she realized she tolerated so much of Sean's unacceptable behavior because she had no model of how a man should treat her. It pained her every time she mulled over this, and now it hurt even more as she found herself stranded in her sorrow with no one to turn to. Janice lost her mother at the tender age of 18. She had since been living with her aunt, but she always felt like an outsider. Her aunt insisted that Janice receive the same treatment as her own children, but Janice knew otherwise. She understood there was no substitute for a mother's love. She managed to stick it out with her aunt's family until she could escape to college. In the blossoming phase of their relationship, living with Sean was nothing short of a paradise for her. The world seemed brighter, and their home was a cocoon of joy and love. However, as the leaves of time turned over, she began to unravel a less pleasing facet of Sean. She realized he was more aware of her vulnerabilities than she had ever been, and was subtly manipulating them for his own advantage. Sean was employed part-time, a fact she was initially accepting of. Meanwhile, she dutifully clocked in her full-time hours, not begrudging him his seemingly easier schedule. However, she began to recognize an unspoken expectation falling heavily on her shoulders. The household chores were her domain alone. Every single day, she found herself knee-deep in dirty laundry, battling with stubborn stains and ironing out wrinkled clothes. Her hands constantly pruned from washing the never-ending pile of dishes, remnants of their meals serving as a constant reminder of her thankless job. And cooking, that was an entirely different ballgame. Every night, like a ritual, she would be seen juggling pans and pots, stirring a delicious meal for Sean, who was ensconced in his own world. Despite all this, she remained silent, choosing to swallow her frustration rather than voice it. "Oh well, it's just one of those things," she would often mutter to herself, downplaying her growing resentment. Sean, on the other hand, was oblivious to her mounting exhaustion. He relished in the luxury of sleeping late, the sun high and bright before he would even stir from bed. His days was often spent locked away in his computer room, engrossed in his virtual world, leaving her alone to manage their real one. One evening while she was busy stirring the pot, she called out, "Sean, could you please give me a hand with setting the table?" "Later, love," came the distant reply from the computer room as always. She sighed, dropping the subject, just as she had done countless times before. Yet the silent plea for acknowledgement lingered in the air, marking the growing distance between them. When Sean's father Robert fell seriously ill, Sean implored Janice to move in with him, expressing a dutiful desire to look after his ailing father. Robert was aging, frail, and evidently incapable of managing himself alone. But as Janice had anticipated, she ended up shouldering the responsibilities of two men instead of one. However, Janice held no resentment toward Robert. Instead, she embraced him as though he were her own father, caring for him with patience and kindness. Robert, in turn, grew exceptionally fond of Janice. He noticed, perhaps more acutely than she realized, the imbalance in the way his son treated her. One day, he shared cryptic advice with her, saying, "You, my dear, were never meant to settle." His words puzzled her, leaving a question in her mind that would resurface later. When Robert's health improved, he suggested they return to their own home, grateful for his recovery but exhausted from the additional caregiving. A few months after they were settled, tragedy struck Janice's family. Her aunt succumbed to a heart attack. Although Janice felt a twinge of sadness that she wasn't treated with the same warmth her aunt showed her own daughters, her heart still ached at the loss. After all, it was this woman who sheltered and fed her after her own mother's untimely death. Deep down, she harbored a profound love for her aunt. 3 days into her mourning, Sean lost his temper at Janice. "She's dead, Janice. Stop bringing her up, and for God's sake, stop crying," he exploded. "Sean," Janice retorted, her voice wavering, "it's only been 3 days." She hadn't even cried that much. Her grief was mostly silent, carried in her heart rather than shown on her face, yet Sean seemed to have little understanding or patience for her quiet sorrow. Now, in the bustling airport, Janice snapped back to reality from her chain of thoughts. A part of her wanted to confront Sean, to vent her anger on his mistress, but it was too late. They had vanished into the crowd, while the airport buzzed with people rushing to catch their flights. She stumbled out into the street, vision blurred with tears. As she blindly bumped into passerby, they deftly steered clear of her. In her emotional haze, she took a turn into a quiet alleyway and found a bench blanketed with snow. She sat down and let her tears flow freely. Janice lost track of time. She was roused from her sobs by the biting cold. In her emotional fog, a blizzard had crept up on her. She stood up, dusted the snow off, and rubbed her frost-coated eyes. Her eyelashes were fluffy with ice crystals, a sight that might have been beautiful if she could have seen it. As she started walking towards the exit of the alley, she noticed a man hunched over on the curb, his figure coated in snow. Her first thought was that he must be out of his mind to sit in this freezing weather. She was too wrapped up in her own turmoil to concern herself with him. As she walked past him, a glimpse of his eyes, empty and lost, tugged at her heartstrings. On impulse, she turned back and walked over to him. She rummaged in her pockets, found some cash, and extended it to him. He looked up at her with his melancholic eyes. He made no move to take the money, just went back to staring blankly into the distance. Caught off guard, Janice blurted, "Excuse me, sir, might you need some assistance?" She received no response. She found herself questioning her actions. What on earth am I doing, offering help to a stranger who won't even acknowledge me? In a desperate attempt, she suggested, "Perhaps I could get you a warm tea or something?" The faintest hint of a smile tugged at the corners of the man's lips. Encouraged, she didn't wait for an affirmation. She stepped into a nearby cafe, purchased a hot tea and a sandwich, and brought them back to the man. Regardless of her own troubles, aiding the man brought a comforting feeling of accomplishment. It was as if she could momentarily set her worries aside. She handed the man the steaming cup of tea and the sandwich. He looked up at her. This time, his eyes reflected gratitude. As she walked away, the residual warmth in her heart made her feel slightly better. She was hailing a taxi when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find the man standing there. "I'm sorry, miss. I forgot to express my gratitude. Thank you for your kindness," he said softly. She responded with a faint smile, It's no trouble at all. We all face problems in life. I hope you find your way out of yours." "Thank you," he replied. Turning around, he slowly began to walk away. As he did, Janice noticed him shivering in the cold. A sudden urge surged within her to extend further help. "Wait," she called out after him. "How about you come to my place? You can warm up there and I can make you a hot meal." The man looked taken aback. "Are you sure? I'm just a homeless man." Janice shrugged. "Have you spotted any royalty here?" "I guess not, but it's unusual. Most people avoid me." "People are different, that's all," she concluded. Janice waved down a taxi. Upon seeing her, the driver wore a friendly smile and held the door open. However, his expression shifted to unease when Janice extended her hand to help the homeless man into the vehicle. "I can't believe it. Are you actually bringing him along?" "He's not stepping foot in my car, lady. I'm sorry." "Excuse me?" Janice replied, taken aback. "I'm sorry, but look at him. He's clearly not clean and he has a strong odor. I'm going to have to cancel your ride." "Who's going to cover the cleaning costs?" the driver retorted. Janice, angered by the driver's blatant disrespect, clenched her jaw, reached into her purse, and pulled out a wad of cash. "Would this sway your opinion?" she asked, handing him the money. The driver took the money, his fingers swiftly counting the bills. Once he recognized the generous amount, a grin spread across his face. "All right then, get in." The hefty amount Janice had handed the driver seemed to make him chatty. He nattered on about the weather and griped about the low fares he usually received. Once they reached their destination, the driver sped away swiftly. Upon entering the warm house, the homeless man let out a satisfied sigh. "It's so cozy here," the man said. "I'm going to heat up some food. You're welcome to warm up here or take a hot shower. The bathroom has towels and a rope you can use." "Thank you. I know I'm imposing, but I'll gladly accept your offer. Things have been pretty tough, particularly without a proper bath," he admitted. Janice questioned her sanity several times over. After all, she had invited an absolute stranger into her home. She didn't even know his name, and now this man was in her bathroom. Regardless of how many times she questioned her decision, she couldn't find a logical explanation. It was a spur-of-the-moment choice. Her life would never be the same from this day forward. She was just putting the finishing touches on the table when the man emerged from the bathroom, fresh and clean. Janice gawked in surprise and finally remarked, "You look like a different person." He chuckled in response. Janice had managed to set the table in the meantime. As Dylan, the guest who had unexpectedly filled the chair usually occupied by Sean, tasted the worm meal, he complimented its flavors. His words weren't just a passing comment, but genuine praise about the deliciousness of the food. As she listened to him, Janice had an epiphany. It had been an eternity since she had received any form of appreciation. Dylan, a man who was still essentially a stranger to her, displayed a keen sense of observation. He pointed out specific elements of the meal, appreciating the subtle blending of spices and the perfect balance of flavors. This simple act of recognition, so genuine and spontaneous, stirred something within Janice. It sent a ripple of excitement through her heart. It was then that she realized how accustomed she had become to her labor of love being overlooked. For so long she had toiled tirelessly without a word of thanks or a morsel of gratitude. But with just a few sincere words, Dylan had managed to validate her efforts, and for that, she felt a warm glow of appreciation. Feeling a sense of comfort in Dylan's company, Janice found the courage to ask, "So, what's your story?" As the words left her lips, she saw a sudden shift in Dylan's demeanor. His easy smile faltered, and his eyes welled up with unshed tears. It was clear that revisiting his past was a road paved with sorrow for him. Just 2 short years ago, Dylan's life was the picture of normality, the kind most people yearned for. A loving wife, a sweet little daughter, and a cozy house in the suburbs painted a picture of perfect domesticity. They had plans for a joyous family trip to celebrate their daughter's 6th birthday. They had all been looking forward to the little getaway, but life had other plans. As they drove on the rain-soaked mountain pass, their car lost control, skidded dangerously, and plunged over the guardrail. In that terrifying moment, Dylan's world was shattered. His wife and daughter, the core of his existence, were cruelly snatched away in the tragic accident. It was a harsh twist of fate that Dylan himself survived the crash, physically unharmed but emotionally devastated. As he shared his story, the pain in his voice echoed in the silence of the room. Janice could feel the heart-wrenching sorrow etched into every word. The anguish of losing his loved ones was more than Dylan could bear. He was engulfed by a sea of guilt, pinning the blame for their untimely deaths squarely on himself. Residing in a house once pulsing with life, the merry laughter of his little girl, the loving whispers of his wife, was now a torturous ordeal. The walls echoed with their memories, every corner a cruel reminder of his loss. To numb the piercing pain and escape his tormenting thoughts, he sought solace in the bitter embrace of alcohol, but the temporary escape soon spiraled into a damaging habit. As he retreated into a shell of self-condemnation, he pushed away everyone who attempted to extend a helping hand. Friends, family, their efforts to pull him out of his despair met with a brick wall of refusal. For Dylan, life had lost its luster, its very essence fading into the gloom of his grief. His mounting addiction and the hollow echo of his family's laughter in his lonely house began to take a toll on his professional life. He received multiple warnings from his employers, each one falling on deaf ears. Inevitably, he was fired. A few months later, with his finances drained and debts mounting, he was evicted from the home that had once been the center of his universe. His life, once marked by love and laughter, had succumbed to an unending spiral of despair. Finding sustenance became a daily battle for Dylan. Initially, he resorted to foraging from trash dumpsters, an experience that left him grappling with feelings of degradation and despair. However, as he gradually learned the ropes of street survival, he discovered that there were some restaurants willing to lend a helping hand to the homeless. Establishments specializing in bread products, such as bagels and sandwiches, often had surplus food that they were willing to give away. His guilt over the tragic loss of his family had initially led him to this destitute lifestyle. However, over time, he began to see the damaging effects of homelessness. The harsh realities of street life began to weigh heavily on him, pulling him down into a cycle of despair that seemed increasingly difficult to escape. The lifestyle he had initially chosen as a form of self-punishment was now trapping him, threatening to consume him entirely. Janice listened to his tale with a heavy heart, her empathy palpable. She reassured him that he shouldn't bear the blame for the accident. She implored him to understand that a life consumed by guilt wasn't worth living. Her words were earnest, full of compassion and wisdom, as she painted a picture of promising future that awaited him if he could only stop blaming himself and start putting his life back together. Throughout their conversation, Janice maintained steady eye contact, her eyes radiating warmth and understanding. Her kind smile never faltered, offering him comfort and acceptance. For Dylan, who hadn't felt such warmth and kindness in 2 long years, her generosity was overwhelming. This encounter with a complete stranger who had not only let him in for a hot shower and a meal, but had also offered him empathy and advice, was a ray of hope in his otherwise bleak existence. The spark of hope that Dylan felt was unlike anything he'd experienced in the past 2 years. He had spent so long aimlessly wandering, living on the streets, nursing his guilt and steeped in his sorrow. He had almost forgotten what it felt like to have a purpose, a goal, a desire for a future that held more than just mere survival. Meeting Janice, receiving her compassion and understanding, and hearing her encouraging words had triggered something within him. He felt a strong pull, a stirring in his heart to break free from his self-imposed chains. He began to envision a future where he could stand tall, a future where the pains of the past did not dictate his path. The desire to change was no longer a mere thought, but a compelling force driving him. He longed for the warmth of a home, the comfort of a steady job, and the healing power of connections with others. Most of all, he yearned for self-redemption, a chance to forgive himself, and the opportunity to rebuild his life from the ruins. At one point, Dylan realized he was still dressed in a borrowed robe. He jumped up, looking at himself awkwardly. "Is this your—" he started, but Janice offered a sad smile. "It's okay. Don't worry about it." Dylan sat back down. Once they had finished their meal, he rose and began gathering his dirty clothes. Sensing his discomfort, Janice told him he could use her washing machine and stay the night. "I'm sorry for being such a burden. I don't even know how to thank you." "It's all right, Dylan. Don't worry. Everything's okay." "Thank you once again." Dylan hesitated before asking his next question. "Janice, may I use your computer, please?" Dylan requested, breaking the silence. "Of course, feel free," she responded, gesturing towards her laptop. As Dylan began clicking away on her laptop, Janice sat in the living room, her mind swirling with her own tales of sorrow. She longed to unburden her heart to this stranger who had shared his deepest pain with her, but the words remained stuck in her throat. Gathering her courage, she rose and walked over to Dylan. "Dylan," she started, her voice shaking slightly, "I don't want you to think less of me for letting a stranger into my home. It's just, my husband, well, I hardly know how to put it. Today he left for a vacation with his mistress." Dylan's fingers froze above the keyboard, and he turned to look at her, his eyes widening in surprise. "Really? That happened?" She nodded, sharing a brief overview of her predicament. Dylan shook his head in disbelief. "I thought this kind of thing only happened in movies. I'm really sorry to hear that." "So what's your next move?" She sighed heavily before responding. "I'm gonna file for divorce, but..." "But what?" Dylan urged her to continue. "I'm just not sure. He might not be on board with the idea." Dylan paused, his brows furrowing before he let out a soft chuckle. "Wait, so let me get this straight. Your husband is off gallivanting with his mistress, and you're worried he might not like the idea of a divorce?" The absurdity of the situation was evident, but it wasn't amusing. As Dylan looked into Janice's eyes, he saw a hint of fear mingling with the confusion. This kind, innocent woman, so beautiful in her simplicity, was caught in a whirlpool of emotional turmoil. "Are you scared of him?" he gently asked. "I don't know. We've been together for 5 years, and now I just don't know what to do." Dylan nodded sympathetically. "Go ahead and get some rest, Janice. We'll figure something out together." Dylan shook his head again and turned back to the computer screen. Exhausted, Janice decided to stretch out on the couch. She was awoken by the sound of her alarm clock the next morning. As she walked into the living room, she realized Dylan was gone. He had left a note on the side table. "Thank you. Till we meet again." Suddenly, the house felt too quiet. Janice was hit by a wave of unexpected loneliness. It was as if she had lost something precious. She shuffled into the kitchen to make herself a coffee. The subsequent 2 weeks passed in a blur. Janice threw herself into her work, staying late into the night just so she could return home exhausted and fall straight to sleep. 3 days after Sean departed, Janice mustered all her courage and started the divorce process. Methodically, she packed up all his belongings, including the robe Dylan had worn after his shower. Now, all she needed to do was deliver the divorce papers, return his possessions, and erase him from her life. She changed the house locks too, just for good measure. This house was her sanctuary, a place that she had inherited from her parents. It was the one thing that was unquestionably hers, and yet she felt a creeping unease that she might have to battle to keep it. Oddly enough, she found her thoughts straying to Dylan more than to Sean. Dylan, who had appeared in her life as a homeless stranger, only to reveal himself as a completely different person. Janice had expected to be devastated by her husband's betrayal, but her heart remained quiet. Instead, she felt a sense of relief. At least she was no longer living in ignorance, fooled by a man she thought she knew. It often happens that everyone else knows about the betrayal, and wives are the last to find out. It can make them appear foolish in the eyes of others. Janice's mood only improved with her newfound freedom. She was already envisioning herself preparing a salad and watching a romantic film, enjoying a quiet evening at home. One evening after work, her tranquil days were interrupted. As she was approaching the house, she saw Sean pacing near the house's entrance, likely cold from the chill. She recalled having blocked his number on her phone and felt a small burst of joy that he hadn't been able to disrupt her day earlier. "Janice, what the hell is going on? What did you do to the lock? And what about my phone? Why do I have to freeze out here?" Sean demanded. Janice faced him calmly, a slight smile gracing her lips as she spoke. "I've changed the lock, Sean, and I've blocked your number." His surprise was evident, but it was short-lived. "Have you lost your mind? Who do you think you are? Hand over the keys now, and you go for a 3-hour walk in the cold. See how you like it." Janice calmly searched through her bag, causing Sean to smirk in satisfaction. She realized with a jolt how accustomed she had become to his bullying tactics, and how often she had let it pass in the past. However, instead of keys, she produced a document. "Here, these are divorce papers." Sean took the papers without thinking. "Whose divorce?" he asked, bewildered. "Ours, Sean. I know you didn't go to the Bahamas by yourself. I saw you with her." You can pick up your belongings any day, just not today. Today, I don't want to see you." He took a few breaths, and when everything dawned on him, he surprisingly spoke quite confidently. "Well, guess what? You're a rat to follow me like that. Good wives close their eyes on such things to save the marriage, and you chose the hard path. I'm a young and handsome man. I'm interesting, and women approach me." Janice interrupted him. "Well, then you won't have to spend the night on the streets." She spoke while looking at the driveway. She had never seen such cars appear in their neighborhood. A convoy of 3 large SUVs quietly entered and stopped. At that moment, Sean grabbed her hand. "You're gonna do what I say. You thought you could leave me just like that? Well, you were wrong. I'm gonna make your life miserable. Give me the keys, now." He raised his other hand to strike Janice. She closed her eyes and in the next moment realized that no one was holding her hand anymore. "Janice, are you okay?" She opened her eyes. It couldn't be. It was Dylan's voice. He was standing in front of her, rubbing his fist. Behind him, Sean was struggling in the snow, while a few strong guys stood between Dylan and Sean. Janice smiled. "It's you?" "Yes, it's me. I was worried I wouldn't make it in time. Any chance you have more of those delicious meals?" Dylan asked, a smile lighting up his eyes. Janice nodded, her eyes suddenly brimming with tears. Evidently, all the pent-up tension and stress had finally found a release. She buried her face into Dylan's chest, staining his expensive coat with tears. He gently patted her back, softly uttering, Hey, it's okay. Everything's okay now." Sean, who was struggling to get back on his feet, was a mere spectator in this emotional reunion. His earlier arrogance was replaced with a stunned and shocked expression. Dylan's arrival not only saved Janice from the immediate threat posed by Sean, but also signaled a turning point in her life. It was the moment when she finally let go of her past and took the first step towards a new and potentially happier life. As for Sean, he watched his whole world crumble in front of his eyes. His threats fell on deaf ears, and the realization of losing Janice began to sink in. Comfortably nestled in front of the television, Janice busied herself with brewing some fresh tea as Dylan began to reveal another part of his life that he hadn't previously shared with her. The words she had imparted to him about letting go of the past and forging ahead had struck a chord deep within him. She had unknowingly guided him towards a newfound sense of purpose and resilience. Once again embarking on the path of professionalism, Dylan returned to his previous job, to the joy and relief of his friends and colleagues who had missed his presence. As an agent for the Secret Service, he held a unique and critical role. His first order of business upon his return was to ensure Janice's safety and security, establishing a protective detail to watch over her. "You pulled me back from the brink, Janice," he admitted. "I couldn't simply overlook the kindness you've shown me." Janice looked at him in disbelief. "Secret Service, huh?" she repeated, trying to comprehend the information. Dylan nodded, sipping his tea. "Yes, I've been working there for years. When I lost my family, I lost myself too. I left everything behind and spiraled into a dark place. I couldn't even bring myself to reach out to my colleagues. But you reminded me that life is worth living, that it's possible to start anew even when it feels like the world has ended." Janice was silent, stunned. A multitude of emotions flashed in her eyes: surprise, confusion, appreciation, and something else Dylan couldn't quite identify. After a moment, she managed a small smile. "Thank you for everything." The tranquil silence that now enveloped Janice's house was a stark contrast to the turmoil that had taken place just an hour earlier. The events had unfolded so swiftly that Janice was still reeling from them. Dylan had departed without uttering any promises, without giving her any clues about his next course of action. He had simply thanked her and left. Remarkably, despite Sean's deeds, Dylan had managed to find a silver lining. In a tone brimming with sarcasm, he thanked Sean for his indiscretions. If it hadn't been for Sean's affair, Dylan would have never crossed paths with Janice. He expressed his gratitude for this unexpected, yet significant meeting, adding another layer of complexity to the day's events. 2 days passed, filled with mundane routine work and quiet evenings at home. The roller coaster of emotions from a couple of days ago had begun to subside, leaving Janice with an unusual sense of tranquility mixed with curiosity about what the future held. One evening, after a long day at work, Janice was heading back home. As she walked along the familiar route, she saw a figure that made her heart flutter. There, standing a little distance from her front gate, was Dylan. He stood tall under the gentle evening light, his silhouette casting a long shadow on the pavement. He was looking her way, a smile illuminating his face. In his hands he held a bunch of flowers, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the fading light of the day. His appearance was significantly different from their last encounter. He was well-groomed and dressed neatly, a far cry from the disheveled man she had first met. His eyes, once haunted by despair, were now twinkling with hope and what seemed like happiness. At that moment, Janice remembered her ex-husband's father's words. "You, my dear, were never meant to settle." She now understood the meaning of his words.